happening. Provide a good laugh for you guys, though. Well, welcome tonight. As Sam said, we're Todd and Angela. We're with Cru, and Church Movements is new within Cru, and it really started just a few years ago because as Cru, kind of the heart of what Cru is all about is win, build, send. Win people to Christ, build them, train them, and equip them in their faith, and then send them out into their areas of influence. And we have many different platforms we're involved in. It got started on the campus ministry. That's what it's best known for. But we are on like over 40 different ministry platforms engaging and trying to be missional and create disciples in that process. And a few years ago, Dave Robinson, the national director, who's actually here in KC with Church Movements, he approached Cru and just said, hey, let's look at what's happening in the churches in America. And many of the churches have been on a slow missional drift because our culture has just changed so much. And it's like, we need to come alongside churches and really engage with them with a lot of the tools, training, and equipping we do. And so that's kind of how the birth of Church Movements came about. We partner with churches to help them do what they've been called to do in fulfilling the Great Commission through training and equipping saints. And so welcome tonight to the changing face of evangelism and the well-being of the city. And welcome to the new normal as the pandemic has shifted everything in our world literally around. And one thing that we see we are moving from less events to more moments in life. And that's how we want to engage people with the gospel. We still need events that are happening through the church, but the most important thing is that God's people become equipped to captivate and capture the moments with people. And so I just want to share about what we're doing. And tonight we're going to look at a perspective, and then we're going to look at some paradigms. And then the second half, after the break, we're going to look at some practical tools, how to share the gospel in a real practical way, looking at some tools that way. And so this is what's important for us as we move forward. How do we engage our communities to impact them with the gospel? And let me be clear, tonight is about how we proclaim the gospel. But understand, we must show the deeds of Christ, the love we do. And we do that a lot. But a lot of times we fail to be able to engage in proclaiming it. So tonight, that's about what we're looking at. How can we proclaim the gospel?
Let me just make sure you can hear me. So as Todd was saying, we want to talk about proclaiming the gospel, but also and we also want to be involved in demonstrating the gospel, right? As believers, we do both of those things. We're concerned that the whole mission, good deeds done and good news told, that those things are in balance, right? Have you noticed sometimes even as individuals or as churches, we tend to focus on one or the other of those things more, the proclaiming of the gospel or the demonstrating of the good news of the gospel? I think that we could see in our own lives or in our churches how we may lean one way or the other. But as a church, as God's people, what we want to do is combine those two so that there are pathways are created to engage in the city's well-being issues. Our city, Kansas City, we have issues that we want to address, and we can address those with the good news of the gospel by both demonstrating the love of God and helping with just practical needs in our city, but also while we're doing that, we're proclaiming the actual good news of the gospel. And that helps churches have non-believing friends. That helps us reach out into our communities. The common ground of engaging in the city and in our community issues allows for gospel conversations and eventually can lead to multiplying communities and planting churches as we engage with well-being issues in our city. We see this in Isaiah 48, 17 through 19, which says, "Your Redeemer says, I am the Lord your God, who teaches you to profit, who leads you in the way you should go. If only you had paid attention to my commandments, then your well-being would have been like a river, and your righteousness like waves of the sea. Your descendants would have been like the sand, and your offspring like its grain. their name would never be cut off or destroyed from my presence.
So, as leaders in this changing day, it's critical that we know how to use investments of our sharing evangelism through the modes we have, through technology, motivation, and tools. And so, first, I think it's really important. Remember what you've been saved from. So we come here and we go, okay, I'm going to learn about sharing my faith and some tools, and we go look at, what's the pathway, how do we do it? But it's got to come from your heart. It's got to be, Lord, let me remember what you have done in my life. Let me remember what I have been saved from and what I've been saved to, the glory of Christ. So let's remember that as we share, because I think that's what gives us empathy and compassion for people. We remember what we've been saved from and to. So I want to look at what's going on in the churches in North America, because I said, our national director just said, hey, our churches are struggling. So in North America, 80% of our churches have plateaued or in decline. So what I mean by that is they've kind of reached their peak or they're losing members. So 80% of the churches are there. 16% are adding members, but I call that they're trading sheep. They go from one church to another. And then you have 3.6 that are actually introducing people to Christ. And then less than, that's supposed to be 0.4. I don't think you can, I have point on my notes. It's 0.4% are multiplying, are planting churches. And so if we look at what's going on in our world, 80% have plateaued or declined. We're losing about 4,000 churches closed every year, and I don't know what the number is with COVID this past year, so more than that. Now here's an astounding fact. The United States is the 4th most unchurched nation in the world based upon population. Let that sink in a moment, because I look across the stage here, and most of us are boomers. I'm not saying all of us are. My wife is not a boomer, but I am. And if you grew up in our culture, I grew up in a Judeo-Christian world. I was not brought up in church. But in my community, I knew what the values of my community were. They were Judeo-Christian. I wasn't brought up in a Christian home, but I knew the values. Today, that's gone. And it's astounding to think how far we've come, even in the last 20 years, of what's happening in our world and in our culture. That we are no longer a Christian nation. We are a post-Christian nation. And so we need to be, here's what we need to think about. We need to share, I want to share this word picture. Think of a greenhouse. A greenhouse is a place that is a controlled environment. It gets the perfect amount of light, water, and nutrients, and it produces incredible things. But it can't thrive out in the real world. And a lot of our churches have become like that. It's like, let's come in and fellowship and worship. Let's make sure we're doing okay and engaging and we're loving and worshiping the Lord. But we need to be less like a greenhouse and more like the wild fields where we can go out and we can thrive. We can thrive inside the church, but the world is lost out there. We need to learn how to get out and become like the dandelion. You think of the dandelion, I know you hate them, they're in your yards. One summer, my girls picked a lot of dandelions and made jelly, so there's something good out of them. But think about the dandelion. All those seeds, when the wind blows, they scatter. And some of them will take root and some of them won't. But that's what we need to be like. We need to be like the dandelion that can thrive in the open fields, that we can go out into the world and we cast the seeds, the gospel, the hope that is within you with the seeds of Christ. And we do that through understanding people, showing them Jesus, empowering Christians to have meaningful conversation, and caring for the needs of the city. So that's important that we do that. So, Angela.
So we want to be able to thrive in the cultural environment that we live in, right? We want to be scattering the seeds of the gospel through meaningful spiritual conversations, but I think we can all agree there are some very real obstacles. So I want to just kind of talk about, as a group, to share some personal barriers that you found to sharing your faith with other people. Could you give me some feedback? What are some barriers to sharing our faith? People don't want to know, so people aren't receptive. Okay, so, right, lack of know-how, feeling like you don't have the answers people might ask. That's legitimate, yeah. Unbelief on the part of the other person or yourself, or both? Yeah. Just, well, it's like resistance, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of unbelief. We live in a post-Christian culture, which is different than a lot of us were raised in, right?
Personally, feeling self-conscious. I'm not going to do it well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to stumble. I'm going to make it look bad.
Right.
And then people aren't interested.
Right.
They're more interested in the latest cultural fad or
Mm-hmm.
social justice issue.
Right. So fear, insecurity, and then people just maybe not being interested in the message of the gospel. Okay? I think we've hit a lot of key ones. Can anybody think of any other personal barriers to sharing your faith? Okay, so it kind of goes along with that fear. What are people going to think of me? I don't want to be rejected. I don't want to be uncomfortable or weird. Right? Yes. I think busyness is a huge thing in our culture. We just don't make the time. We don't focus on that. We're not intentional enough, right? Do you find that possibly you don't have a lot of friends who are not Christians? You know, so maybe there's really nobody in your realm of influence that doesn't know God. And so you're not sure who you would share with. So that could be a barrier. I think we hit a lot of the key barriers. Lack of desire, fear, lack of know-how, precious few associations with non-believers, busyness. I think these are all very real barriers to sharing our faith. Outside of personal barriers, we also have a lot of cultural barriers. And you kind of alluded to that. There tends to be a failure of reason and a loss of belief in truth. Have you noticed that? It's really, people are kind of suspicious of reason. Objective truth, the world kind of considers objective truth to be out of reach because truth is only personal, right? Like you have your truth, I have my truth. That's kind of what the world says now. We're surrounded with diverse religious expressions, ethnicities, cultures, and postmodernism declares that pluralism is the way things are, right? There's lots of different beliefs and they're all equally valid. So it kind of goes beyond the idea of being tolerant and respectful to the idea of declaring that there's really no absolute truth at all. So we're up against that cultural mentality. There's also pan-tolerance, which is a belief, it's sort of the same idea, the belief that all thoughts, ideas, and opinions are equally valid. And so that nobody can claim a truth above another truth, right? If you do, then that makes you intolerant or manipulative maybe, or power hungry, something like that. Have you noticed also a loss of authority in culture? So I think that is a key cultural barrier that we now face today, because if there's no ultimate truth, then there's not a book like the Bible or a group like the church that can command our respect or that can call us to a commitment. Moral relativism, so morals and values, those are now self-determined. That's personal. It's a personal choice. There's not an ultimate morality according to the world. And then this negative perception of Christians, I think, can be a very real barrier in today's culture. So what I'd like you to do in your groups for just a few minutes, can you talk with each other about what do you feel like is the greatest barrier for you personally? And then maybe what is the greatest barrier you see just as a church? And they may be the same, but take a few minutes to kind of discuss that at your tables, and then we'll come back together.
Okay, we'll pull it back in. I appreciated what Brent said at my table because it resonated with me. He used the word, I get into my tunnel vision. And, I get a list of things I need to get done in a day, and I just get focused, and I just, in my busyness and in my tunnel vision, I just can be task-oriented. And it's like, Lord, slow me down and make me present. So we need to ask the question, what is needed today? And we need people who will engage in conversation that is gracious, rational, and calm. People who will be understanding, show wisdom, and have patience. Because as we look at what does Gen Z and millennials look for, they are looking for something different than what our generation did. Now, let me say this about Gen Zs and millennials. Sometimes they get a bad rap, and I know we've got an older crowd here, so sometimes it's easy to point them out. But here's what I will say about Gen Z and millennials. First of all, about 90% of them want nothing to do with Christianity. That's alarming. That's one of the reasons why we're the fourth most unchurched nation in the world. They want nothing to do with Christianity. And that is the next wave of leaders in this country. So just think about where we're going and what that's going to look like for your grandchildren. So that is alarming. But here's what millennials do bring to the table. They want purpose and they want meaning. They're more concerned about doing something worthwhile and meaningful than earning a big paycheck. For boomers and all of us, it's kind of like, hey, we got to make the money. For them, it's kind of like, I want something that is purposeful. So that is a generation we need to tap into, we need to engage, and we need to celebrate them. When they walk through the door, hey, we got to love on them. And they might look at the world a little bit differently. Hey, they need to feel like they belong before they'll start believing. And so I know we were brought up like, hey, I want you to believe, and then you can belong with us. It's like, no, I'm going to love you where you are. So here are some things that they're looking for. They're looking for authenticity. That is very important. So first impressions are important with them. They want to know that you're genuine, that you're real, that you're going to engage with them. They want to see community. So if they hear something about your faith, it's kind of like, okay, I met Brent. Brent, okay, I heard you tell me about God. So that might work for you, but can it be lived out in the community? I want to see it lived out in the community before I actually invest. And so that's why our church is critical. This is our community. This is your spiritual family. Your church, your small groups, how you're engaging with one another, how you're caring for one another and loving one another. Community is very important in what they see. They want to have a safe conversation. Now, contrary to what many believe, including what I believed at first, is they want to have great conversation. They want to have spiritual conversation. Not so much church conversation, but they're very open spiritually to explore things. Angela mentioned the word, kind of a pan tolerance. It's kind of like, whatever works for you is great. And they want to explore beliefs, but they want to do it in a way that it's safe. And many times they feel like Christians having an agenda and they're coming at them. So it's kind of like, you're not going to be so safe. So how do you engage in safe conversation with them? We're going to address that later this evening. Genuine answers to their questions. We got a great resource we're going to point out to you later tonight about that. But how do you answer their questions in a way that's not cheesy, in a way that's authentic and real and not judgmental? And finally, they want meaningful investment. And so, I mentioned that. They're looking for purpose. That's very important for them. So when you see young people walk through the door, volunteerism is a big thing in this culture. I didn't grow up, I hardly ever heard that word. I mean, if you volunteered, it was kind of like, oh, that's good for you. And now it's really encouraged, which is great. Find ways to give them purpose in what they do. So with all that said, the church needs to make some adjustments because we've given off kind of a bad stigma. And I can say that because I wasn't brought up in the church. And I knew my parents, who were kind of depression children, make comments about the church. And so we need to stop talking and listen more. And we're going to address that here in a little bit. But we need to make sure we're listening and engaging with hearing what they're saying. We need to know, they need to know what the church is for, not what we're against. We had the moral majority growing up in the 70s and 80s and everything they were against, and I get it. But for them, it's like, in the church, they're always against stuff. But what are you for? And we should really be about how we're engaging our community, how we're loving people, how we're caring for people. Historically, you look at all the major things that have happened in history, pandemic will be one of them, but you look at throughout history, it's always Christians who have gone into the danger to help. And we need to be willing to risk that aspect, to engage our culture. We're seen as having archaic beliefs. You know, it's like, oh, that's so old. You know, no one does that anymore. So, you know, we have to hold on to our values, but we have to engage it in a gracious way. And please don't make the church political. That is really ramped up here with the last election and now with the pandemic. It seems like everything, there's so many things people are arguing over, and people, it's stupid. It's stupid. What's important is how are we advancing the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. So whether you mask or don't mask, whether you voted for Biden or Trump, you know, make it about, are you loving Jesus? And how are you showing that love? It's important to remember that time cannot be short-circuited. It is crucial to build that relationship over time and to maintain it.
So Todd was just sharing a little bit more about some of the younger generations, what's most important to them, relationship, authentic relationship. I mean, that is the key thing. And so I want to share a little bit about a lifestyle that really focuses on relationship. As we know, the Lord does the work of drawing people to himself. We know that. But statistics tell us that the average person, it takes 2 to 6 months of exposure to the gospel in various ways for a person to come to faith in Christ. That, at least in today's culture. That's not always the case, but in general, 2 to 6 months. And so that's relationship building, that time. Okay, so the goal of what we call a prayer, care, share lifestyle really is to work through natural relationships with people in your life so that they can know and experience the love of God through their friendship with you. The process begins by thinking of someone you'd like to introduce to Christ, and then praying for discernment about how you can really show love towards that person and how you can begin to work towards sharing the gospel. Now, we talked about this earlier. One of the key barriers for some of us might be, who would we share the gospel with? Like, really trying to think of someone, like who in our world might be far from God. And so the first step for you might be really being more intentional in your patterns of life. That means maybe going to the same coffee shop so that you're getting to know your barista. Our daughter's been a barista this summer, like it's her dream job. And she literally has tons of regular customers that she's in conversation with all the time, like almost daily, every other day. She's a believer, so she can share with them. But as a customer coming into a situation like that, you can get to know people in your checkout line, like making a deliberate choice to go through the same line over and over. I made a choice about 1.5 years ago to join a board of an activity that my girls were involved in. And it wasn't because I needed more to do with my time and wanted to, add something else to my calendar. It was specifically with the purpose of being with a group of 8 to 10 women who, most of which, did not have a personal relationship with God. And I knew that. And so when that opportunity opened itself to me, I said yes, because I knew that that would be a place that I could begin to develop relationships. So the process begins with that prayerful consideration and just asking the Lord, who are people in my life that I could begin to share with? And that might mean changing some patterns in my life. The next step is just finding tangible ways to care for those people. Our neighbors are great, easy people to share with. We live right next door to them. We see them coming and going. And I think during the pandemic, there was an emphasis of that in our churches because we were all home more. So I'm hoping that momentum with our neighbors can continue. And those would be people you can find very tangible ways to show care for. And then the final step in this prayer, care, share lifestyle is just finding opportunities to engage in spiritual conversations. So sharing Christ begins and ends with prayer. So through prayer, we express our dependence on God. And then, of course, we find power through the Holy Spirit to have fruitful, bold conversations with people around us. Bill Bright, who's the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, said, "Successful evangelism is simply taking the initiative to share Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit and leaving the results to God." And that kind of takes the pressure off of us. We're not there to get results. We're there just to share. We're initiating. And I think you're hearing us say something a lot, and it's very intentional, initiating spiritual conversations. Because sometimes we put evangelism in this box and we think it's always about sharing the full gospel and calling somebody to a decision. Well, eventually that may happen, but just initiating maybe just initiating conversation, there's your first step, and starting, like I just shared, starting to care for people and love people. And then eventually it becomes initiating spiritual conversation that may or may not involve the gospel the first time, right? And then eventually that leading to an actual gospel conversation. So I think if we could take that pressure off and see it the way that Bill Bright does, where we're just initiating and letting the power of the Holy Spirit, God is the one doing the work.
So you heard Angela talk about it can take 2 to 6 months of just regular engagement with someone, seeing the gospel lived out and proclaimed before they might come to a point of decision. So I want to look at 3 modes of evangelism, and then I'm going to take a little poll at the end. First, body. You came to Christ primarily through the influence of a body of believers. That would be the church. So that was a huge part of me when I came to faith. I got engaged in a church that really loved me like the church should and embraced me. The second one is natural. You come to Christ primarily through the witness of someone you knew personally. So this could be a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor, someone who shared the gospel with you personally. And finally, ministry. You came to Christ primarily through an event or an outreach, like trunk or treat. And so I know that is in an event you do. And so there's 3 different modes. And actually I had this previously in my notes, I want to mention it. At your trunk or treat last year, I was here, and this was definitely a millennial or Gen Z, and I was dialoguing with him, and he said, "Yeah, I left the church about 10 years ago, but if there's anything I can do to help in the community, I would be interested." So here's someone who is like, he wants purpose. He's saying, "I'll be engaged, but I'm not interested in the church, but I'm willing to do something." And so again, if we're demonstrating ourselves out in the community by loving our community, that does open up the doors for the gospel. So you see the 3 modes of influence. So my question, how many of you came to faith primarily with someone, an individual, sharing Christ with you, and you became a believer? Just a show of hands. So about a quarter of you, okay. How many came through, I would say, the body, through the church, where you just were brought up in the church? Okay, less of you. And then finally through an outreach event. Okay. So we know in our culture today, it's going to be, to reach this generation, it's going to be less about events and it's going to be more about moments. How we engage people in the moments that we're involved with them. So our neighbor across the street, our co-worker, how are we engaging them? Because again, this is how people come to Christ, through one of these 3 ways. And for the younger generation, yes, I'll talk to you about it, but I want to make sure I see it. So they might eventually come to church. But back in the day, you could invite people, "Hey, you want to come to church with me?" And that wasn't a weird question. Today it can be a little bit weird to some people, and you don't want to scare them off. You want to engage with them in that relationship.
So I want you to picture gospel communities that are multiplying in our city, which means a growing number of believers who are equipped and empowered to have significant gospel conversations as a way of life. That's what we're talking about, a way of life, people who are demonstrating the love of Jesus everywhere. Okay, so this is a paradigm shift in thinking that evangelism is the role of the professionals, right? Like just the pastors or missionaries, or like Todd said, moving away from the idea that evangelism is strictly event-driven or church-driven. It can certainly happen in those ways, but I think our culture is shifting, and in order for this vision to become a reality, we need believers who can and do engage in spiritual conversations with people in just their everyday context of life. We always say where we live, work, learn, and play. Just all those areas of life where we interact with people as believers, just the everyday Christian sitting in the pew, they're thinking of sharing their faith as a natural thing that all of us do. That's the kind of culture we need to start creating in our churches. Do you see the difference in creating a culture versus thinking of evangelism as this separate thing that other people do, or a formal thing that, only the trained professionals can do? I think it's a pretty huge paradigm shift, and it's something we need to begin to think through. I want to provide an introduction to a framework that's been effective in doing that and helping us make that shift, okay? But I want to start by telling a story. Jennifer grew up Catholic and attended Mass occasionally. She had parents who she thought of as religious, and she would think of herself as spiritual because she believes in God, and she prays occasionally. Jennifer and I knew each other from the gym, and we had known each other for 2 or 3 years. We had been working out together. We had, a casual friendship, but I had really wanted to explore some deeper subjects with her. But she's in her late 20s, I'm in my late 40s, and I just really wasn't sure how to move that friendship forward, especially because at the gym we didn't have a lot of time to talk. We're out of breath, we're running. And so eventually she had experienced a tragedy in her family life and was really hurting, and realized that she needed some extra support and care in her life. And I had learned about this tragedy. She had been sharing with me little bits and pieces of her life, over the years. And she knew I was a Christian, but that was really kind of as far as it went, as far as what we knew about each other and our stories. And I had actually been to a training very similar to this and had learned some specific tools. And so I was able to finally initiate with Jennifer and ask her if she wanted to get together sometime outside of the gym context and just to visit and hear more about her story, and she agreed to. And so we went and had coffee, and that was the first of many spiritual conversations that we began to have. I didn't really realize at the time that she was kind of looking for a mentor. She needed more people who could speak into her life about some of her relationships, her relationship with her boyfriend and her parents and in her workplace. And so I was somebody who could kind of step into that role a little bit, but it took me asking. It took me thinking intentionally about that relationship. And so we started to meet every now and then, a lot of texting because she's like, 27, 28, some phone calls. And so she ended up moving out of state for graduate school last year and has since started attending an evangelical church in her area that I had recommended. By the grace of God, she moved somewhere where a very good friend of mine had been in an excellent church. And so I just recommended the church to her, even though she had grown up Catholic. She didn't even know the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism when we first started talking. So we had already had those conversations, and so she has really moved forward spiritually. Okay, so that's kind of the story I want you to keep in mind. So there are 3 participants in this divine drama, okay, and they're each illustrating a foundational principle for this framework, which we call co-journers. So the first participant is Jennifer. Right? She was clearly on a spiritual journey. And that's true because everyone is on a spiritual journey. They can't help it. God has created us as spiritual beings. And some might be moving towards God, some are moving away from God, others might be stuck, but we're all on a spiritual journey. We don't start people's spiritual journey, we just join in. We just join what God is already doing in the lives of other people. The second actor in this divine drama is God himself. And God was already at work in Jennifer's life. He was already working, and we know that evangelism is always first and foremost a work of God. It's not about us. God uses us and invites us to join what he's doing in the lives of people. And then that brings us to the third participant. There I am, just an everyday believer. I'm working out with her. We're just having normal conversations that any one of us, might have in that situation. And she's opening up a little. And it was over, like I said, a period of a couple of years, right? But I was alert to the opportunity with her. And then I initiated a little bit more. She would have probably never asked me to go have coffee with her. I mean, I really don't think so, because the relationship was kind of strictly at the gym. But she was really open. It just took me asking. And God wanted to use me. God wants to use us in the lives of other people, the people that we intersect with in everyday life. So Sojourners is just a way of describing evangelism in which we join other people in their spiritual journeys and help them come to Jesus. So the key principles for this paradigm or this framework for thinking about evangelism, you just heard them in the story that I told. Every person is on a spiritual journey. God is always at work in the lives of people, and he really wants to use you, okay? And so what I experienced as a co-journer with Jennifer is what we want people to experience over and over again, engaging in significant conversations in which they discover where others are in their spiritual journeys and how God wants to use them, okay? So if we want to change the culture in our churches, we need to be telling these kinds of stories to each other all the time. Like it won't just be the person that I led to Christ 10 years ago. It'll be the person that I talked to last week in the grocery store. It'll be the person that I engaged in spiritual conversation yesterday when I was at the gym. You see what I mean? It's the more we begin to hear other people telling those stories. I heard somebody say, we change culture. Culture is shaped by the stories we tell, the heroes we celebrate, and the language we use. So let's celebrate this idea of initiating spiritual conversation, sharing our faith. Let's tell those stories in our small groups, right? If you're in a small group, why don't you begin to tell stories about the way you were able to initiate spiritual conversations? It may not always lead to a gospel conversations, but the more we hear it, I think the more it's normalized and the less fear we have. And the more that I do it, the more I realize people are more open than we think they are, truly. Most people really are open to a spiritual conversation. And so we want that to be happening over and over again. When we do that, it's the fulfillment of what Paul exhorts us to do in Colossians 4, 5, and 6, which says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity or moment, as Todd keeps saying. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. So this verse describes this co-journer experience, which is just engaging in meaningful and eventually spiritual conversations. It sets up the roles, this idea of co-journers, it sets up roles that we can play in other people's lives in their spiritual journeys. So I'm going to describe these 4 primary roles. And like I said, think of this as just a paradigm. It's just a way of thinking about evangelism, okay? So whatever way you've been used to thinking of it, maybe you've always thought of evangelism as like just sharing the 4 spiritual laws, like a tract. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, let's try to expand the way we think of it. When we hear the word evangelism, let's now begin to think of relationship, joining people in their spiritual journey, and playing a role in their life, okay? So the first role is an explorer. So just think of that word picture. What does an explorer do in everyday life? They enter unknown territory to discover, learn, and understand, right? And I would say most people's spiritual journeys are unknown territory to us, even if we've known them for a while, okay? Unless it's like a church friend, and you might not even know a lot of your church friends, spiritual backstories. I don't know. But a lot of that is unknown territory for us. But as explorers, we begin to engage with people and discover who they are and where they are on their spiritual journey. And then whatever we discover we determine what other role we might play in their lives. And this role, the explorer role, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it starts with listening and asking good questions, okay? So I would say maybe 3 weeks ago, you know how summer you just lose track of time? You know, you're like on lake time or beach time or something. But maybe 3 weeks ago, a new gal had come to the gym, and so we had talked, you know, I had just kind of asked her like basic stuff, like, hey, you have any kids? And, you know, so we had chatted like while we're running or whatever. And the second time I saw her, she was wearing a cross necklace. But based on some of the things that she had said and sort of the way she had expressed herself the first time I had met her, I wasn't certain that she was a Christian, you know, like I really wasn't sure if she was walking with God or far from God. And so I just asked her, it was very natural. I just said, hey, I noticed your necklace. Does that have like personal significance for you? And she didn't even skip a beat. She was like, yeah, you know what? Actually, I haven't been involved with church and have had nothing to do with God for a lot of years. But just recently, I started attending a church and realized like it can be like a personal relationship. I mean, she's just telling me this at the gym. I'm like, yes, it can. I mean, it was an immediate open door for, because I'm still not certain she's made a decision to follow Jesus, but she may have. If so, she's a very new Christian, because we've only gotten so far. Like I was out of town, then she was out of town. But that's just an example of taking an opportunity and asking a really simple question. I ask people all the time about their tattoos, because there's so many tattoos, right? And it's a great conversation starter, and they usually have meaning. I mean, almost always. People don't get tattoos for no reason. So if you can find the story behind the tattoo, that often will open a door. I often think of that as like a window to the soul. Like people will tell you something meaningful about their life, with just a simple question like that. So the explorer role, we're listening, we're asking good questions, right? You might end up being able to be a guide, which is another role for a cojourner. A guide shows the way, leading others to a specific destination. So think of a tour guide, a museum guide. A good guide knows where they're going, knows how to get from here to there, and is able to lead others on a journey with them. So, you know, you might start a relationship with someone. We know that the destination for us in guiding someone is not a place, it's the person of Jesus. And we know that that person is who empowers us to have those conversations. To change roles from an explorer to a guide, you might just ask permission to share a little bit of your story. You might just say, hey, can I share something that's made a difference in my life? Something that I often ask, if somebody shares a struggle with me, and have you noticed, like, people do share their struggles. People want a place, like a safe place to tell you. Like sometimes like the person just checking you out starts to tell you like their life story. I don't know if that happens with men as much, but it happens with women, where the gal just starts telling you like her troubles, and you're listening, and there's not a whole lot, you don't know exactly what to say, but you could ask a question like, hey, can I share something that really gives me hope in difficult situations? Hardly anybody's, I mean, I've never had anybody say no to me when you just say, hey, can I share something that gives me hope? And then you begin to share a little bit of your story. And you may not get to the gospel in that conversation. You might, though. You might get to the full gospel if you're sharing about hope. But you might just begin that conversation, okay? Journeys sometimes encounter obstacles, right? When we're on that's true in the physical world, like if you're trying to build a bridge over the Mississippi River. You know, the river is an obstacle. You build a bridge over it. So that's another role, a builder in somebody's spiritual journey. You're coming alongside them. You're recognizing obstacles, and then you are helping build a way over and beyond that obstacle. So you don't have to bring an exhaustive answer, but just a helpful one. Sometimes people have just a couple questions that are real barriers for them, and if they could just get an answer, it might not even be an exhaustive answer, that might help pave the way for at least an openness to hearing the gospel, or an openness to God that they didn't have before. Something that somebody said to me one time that was so helpful was, don't feel like you have to answer questions people are not asking. So you know that fear element about sharing the gospel, sharing our faith? We're afraid of what questions they're going to ask. Sometimes, like, we're just trying to get to the gospel, so, like, we're trying to answer all these questions. They're not even asking. They're just asking, like, how do I parent my terrible twos kid? You know, my kid that's my toddler. Or how do I work through these marital problems? People are asking real everyday life questions. And the great thing is we actually do have the best answer in Jesus. We really do. And so we don't have to answer questions they're not asking. Whatever question they're asking, we actually do have the ultimate answer. And we can get to that if we're listening and we're being patient and we're being gracious and we're finding opportunities to plant those seeds along the way, right? The fourth role is a mentor. Everybody needs to be encouraged and helped along the way, right, in their spiritual journeys, especially after they come to Christ. So the mentor is usually somebody coming alongside a new believer, somebody who's made a decision. Yes, I want to follow Jesus, but I have no idea how or what that looks like. And so you're coming alongside to kind of help them. So these are the 4 word pictures, the 4 roles that make up this paradigm or framework called co-journers. Again, just a new way maybe of thinking about evangelism. There's a logical connection between the roles, but it's not necessarily chronological. I mean, we always start as an explorer. We're always starting with asking good questions and listening and just hearing where people are on their spiritual journey. But then what role you play next is just going to depend on how that conversation goes and what you learn. So I do want you now at your tables, we're going to interact a little bit more. I want you to talk about how does the idea of journeying with someone maybe help you overcome some of those barriers we talked about before. If you're thinking about evangelism a little bit differently now, how would that help you overcome some barriers, okay? And how would these 4 roles help change some of the ways, again, images that you might have of evangelism? If you're thinking about these roles, how would that help you change the way you think about evangelism and overcome some barriers? Just take a couple minutes to think about that at your tables.
Do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from getting through? Do you wish that you could see it all made new? Is all creation groaning? Is a new creation coming? Is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst? Is it good that we remind ourselves of Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah, who conquered the grave. He's David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. Is he worthy? Is he worthy of all blessing and honor and glory? Is he worthy of Does the Father truly love us? Does the Spirit move among us? As our God intends to dwell